spaceship has landed, and that's true logic. Word. So today I want to talk briefly about small talk, right? And why I don't like small talk. Okay. And I'd like to start with paraphrasing of a statement made by the philosopher Martin Heidegger in his book Being in Time. And he talks about idle talk, right? And one of the things that he mentions is how idle talk has this sort of fervor and energy to it that passes from one subject to another subject and on and on. And this is a continuous process of essential nothingness language, right? And he talks about how in common talk and idle talk, the common foundation in thinking and attitude is that everybody understands the conversation, everybody knows what's being discussed, everybody has a clear view of the subject at hand, right? And everybody, quote unquote, knows what's being talked about, right? For example, let's say someone was having a general idle conversation about the nature of the world and politics, and someone says, the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer, right? And they just make that sort of general phrase without any more substantive, like, depth or analysis of what that statement actually means, right? Hence why the conversation is just idle, because it's on a surface level, like, basis. It's not about anything deep or substantive, right? Now, the issue with that is when individuals commonly become caught up in repetitious, idle talk, right? Like, everybody always continuously talking about nothing, right? And when that nothingness burns out, the steam of it, they move on to the next nothingness thing, right? And when you look at the nature of contemporary social media culture, you might argue that in many critical ways it perpetuates that sort of idle talk nature, right? The idea of people sharing what they ate for breakfast or what they're eating for dinner, or the mundane activity that they're doing of waking up in the morning, or how they're doing their makeup, right? These generally mundane everyday activities are now commonly represented on the internet as sort of like aspects of excitement in a certain type of way, right? When they're really just idle things, right? But that sort of idleness of human behavior has become, promoted, has become common, right? And that's one of the flaws of idle talk that Martin Heidegger points out, and I second that for sure, right? I don't like to do continuous idle conversations with people that ultimately don't serve you intellectually, spiritually, in any type of way whatsoever, right? But it also seems to be on a fundamental level a way that people bond with each other in social engagements, right? Sort of people have this sort of fear of that deep substantive reflection. And Friedrich Nietzsche, he points this out in his books, The Antichrist. He points it out in Beyond Good and Evil, and he points it out in The Will to Power as well, right? And in these books, he talks about how, right, the herd mentality is sort of the easier path, right? It's the path that everybody else is choosing, right? It's the path of submitting to a certain set of values, to someone else's conceptualization of the world and being, right? And you submit to their values, and you submit to their way of thinking, and you subsequently submit to their way of conversing as well, right? So, my thing about that is, again, everybody submitting to this common ideal that leads to a common way of thinking and a common way of communicating with each other in society. And that's what becomes idle talk, right? Oh, what nice weather today, right? Like that idle talk. Or, oh, what do you do for a living? Oh, that more idle talk, right? That the aim of it is aimless, right? It's conversation simply for the sake of words themselves, right? The objective is none. The objective is the mere conversation itself, right? Though that brings forth certain Eastern philosophies, right? And one might challenge that idea and say, well, okay, everything from that perspective is just idle talk, right? Because in the grand scheme of things in the universe, all words, all ideas, all imaginations of human beings are void or meaningless insofar as they are not truly reflected in the realities or the physical realities of the world, right? So if that's true, one might say that Heidegger's perspective is somewhat elitist. Though Heidegger's talking about the importance of an individual finding their true individual selves, right? Their authentic type of being. But you can't be authentic if you're enraptured in idle being, in idle talk, in idle engagements, right? That ultimately do not serve you on a substantive level, right? And that's the same thing that Friedrich Nietzsche talks about in The Herd. It's that idea of getting too wrapped up in the social sphere in that type of way, right? And in today's social media culture, that idea is highly encouraged, right? But nonetheless, it ultimately does not serve an individual's purposes who are seeking to discover their truest self, right? Because your truest self, though influenced and shaped and created as a product of society, is fundamentally distinct from that society, right? But you never get to truly experience or understand those fundamentally distinct individual characteristics if you are too enraptured in social being, right? So I tend to avoid those types of idle conversations with individuals for that reason, right? For the sake of preserving my own individuality. But having gained my individuality, I bring that forth to conversations and engagements with others. However, this always leads to this sort of like, stalemate or of sorts, right? It's in-depth critical conversation being faced with idle conversation that ultimately doesn't lead anywhere, right? It's like people talking through each other essentially, and no real production is happened from the conversation, which is why everyone can't have the same types of conversations with everybody else. And perhaps some types of conversations simply shouldn't be had, right? I mean, for me, I think that on a critical level, ideas that are essentially idle thoughts should simply be left to that, right? Let them pass by. Why feel the need to converse them with other people? Let me know what your thoughts are. Do you enjoy small talk, as they call it, idle conversations with individuals? And that was True Logic. Spaceship blasting off.